In 1524, a Portuguese merchant by the name of Duarte Coelho arrived in central Vietnam with a fleet of ships, seeking trade and transporting Catholic missionaries. Records show that leaders in Vietnam had prior contacts with the West, going as far back as the Roman Empire, with merchants arriving by land in 166 AD. More recently and more famously, Marco Polo had arrived with an expedition in 1292. But Europeans being able to reach East Asia by sea was a new thing. When the ships arrived, Vietnam was in the midst of what had been a 30-year period of instability. In 1527, General Mac Deng Tu killed the emperor of the Lý dynasty and exiled others before crowning himself as a new empire, establishing the Mac dynasty in the north. In 1533, officials linked to the Lý dynasty crowned a new Lý emperor to rule areas they still controlled in the south. In 1537, this new extension of the Lý dynasty sought the support of China to retake the throne in the north, and China sent a reported 125,000 soldiers. But before a conflict could occur, General Mac made a deal with China to become a Chinese protectorate if they stayed out of the conflict and withdrew their troops. With China now supporting both emperors, and therefore neither emperor, a nearly 60-year-long civil war broke out between the two factions. In 1592, the Lý dynasty coalition was able to recapture the city of Hanoi. They executed the rule of the Mac dynasty, and then had control of the empire in the north as well as the south. But just 8 years later, in 1600, another faction in the south emerged. Members of the Nguyen clan began separating themselves in the Lý Empire. Using connections to Portuguese traders, they began building fortifications and purchasing Portuguese artillery for their personal use. By 1615, with training from Portuguese engineers, this group were able to produce their own bronze cannons. With these new weapons and fortifications, in 1620, a group calling themselves the Nguyen Lords refused to continue to pay tribute to the north. This led to a roughly 55-year-long civil war, with the division between north and south falling along the Xai River. When it became clear that neither side was able to win decisively, a truce was reached in 1672, partitioning the country into north and south. Europeans generally referred to the northern empire as Tonkin, and the southern as Cochin China. But before this truce, in 1624, roughly 100 years after the first Portuguese fleet, a French Jesuit priest by the name of Alexandre de Rhodes arrived and began translating church texts into Vietnamese. Similar efforts in Japan had resulted in the Japanese government banning not only Catholicism, but Christianity out of fear it would be disruptive to the state. So when Rhodes returned to Europe in 1650, in addition for calling for more bishops, he also asked for military support, writing, quote, "We have all reason to fear that what happened to the Church of Japan could also happen to the Church of Annan, because these kings, in Tonkin as well as in Cochin, are very powerful and accustomed to war. It is necessary that the Holy See, by its own movement, give soldiers to these oriental regions, where Christians multiply in marvelous ways, lest, without bishops, these men die without sacrament and manifestly risk damnation." In 1658, the Society of Foreign Missions of Paris was formed, and by 1652, the Society had established a base in nearby Thailand. They were given the following instructions, quote, "Do not act with zeal, do not put forward any arguments to convince these people to change their rights, their customs, or their usages, except if they are evidently contrary to their religion and morality. What would be more absurd than to bring France, Italy, Spain, or any other European country to the Chinese? Do not bring them our countries, but instead bring them the faith, a faith that does not reject or hurt the rights, nor the usages of any people, provided that these are not distasteful, but that instead keeps and protects them." Portuguese and French missionaries attempted to expand the church to northern Vietnam, but they were expelled by the ruler Chin Tak in 1664. But there were some successes in other parts of the country, including the establishment of a convent of Vietnamese nuns. Throughout this time, trade and financial interactions grew, often by supplying each faction of the Civil War with weapons, with the Portuguese supplying the south and the Dutch supplying the north, sometimes in exchange for slaves, which the Dutch took to their colony in Taiwan. After the truce was reached between the north and the south, the Nguyen lords in the south sought to expand south to conquer an area then known as Champa, in the lower Mekong Delta. These military expansions allowed them to acquire the area around what is now Saigon. In 1771, 3 brothers from a peasant community, known as the Tây Sơn Brothers, led a popular uprising starting in the south. They were recruited on a slogan which translates to, quote, "Fair, no corruption, only looting the rich and help the poor." In 1773, the brothers were able to capture the city of Quy Nhon, reportedly after delivering one of the brothers to the town in a cage, pretending he'd been captured. However, after the cage was taken to the city, past the walls, the brother was able to escape and open the gates of the city to allow invasion. As the uprisings continued to grow in the south, northern Vietnamese rulers saw weakness in their rivals. They sent troops south, claiming that they were coming to help put down the rebellions, but more realistically, they were trying to occupy the area for themselves. The southern rulers had to flee their capital in Hue to make a stand in what was more defensible, Saigon, as the forces from the north and rebels converged. Rather than fight, the Tay Son rebels negotiated peace with the northern Vietnamese, ceding territory to them, including the capital. The northern forces accepted the peace and marched back north to what had been the capital of southern Vietnam, in the city of Hue. However, disease outbreaks in Hue severely weakened the forces. As the war continued, the Tay Son forces killed all but one of the ruling Nguyen family. That last family member, Nguyen Phu An, was able to flee to Siam after being sheltered and protected by a Catholic priest who helped him flee to the south and connected him with a Catholic bishop by the name of Pierre Bignou Bihan. Initially, the Tay Son included some ethnic Chinese generals and was initially supported by the Chinese merchants in southern cities who resented high taxes and the restricted laws of the old regime. But this alliance led to tension with Vietnamese peasants who viewed the movement as being for them and resented Chinese influence. This led to a division in the rebellion, with some ethnic Chinese, particularly those living in urban areas, supporting the old regime out of self-preservation. In retaliation, when the Tay Son were able to capture Saigon in 1782 for a brief period of time, while in control of the city, their troops massacred between 4,000 and 20,000 ethnic Chinese living in the city. While all of this was going on, Nguyen An collaborated with Catholic bishops to aid a coup in neighboring Cambodia in 1780. The bishops used their connections to France to obtain grenades and ships for the coup. As one observer put it, quote, Bishop Pierre Joseph Georges of French nationality has been chosen to deal with certain matters of war. This all meant that the last living member of the Nguyen dynasty was able to regroup in Cambodia to return. The Tay Son had turned their attention north in an attempt to unify southern and northern Vietnam. Northern Vietnam had recently been ravaged by famine and floods, and in just 3 years, the Tay Son were able to topple the dynasty there, creating a unified Vietnamese state. But the unity was short-lived, as in 1787, the three brothers, each given a section to govern in the south, soon found themselves at war with each other. And in the north, the Qing dynasty in China was loath to give up their tribute state. A Chinese army of an estimated 200,000 crossed into northern Vietnam in 1788, occupying Hanoi without any real resistance from the Tay Son forces. But the Tay Son had only fled to regroup. The holiday of Tet occurs each year in either late January or early February, and signifies the new year, involving rituals and celebrations. Tay Son troops used this holiday to launch a surprise offensive against the Qing dynasty, attacking with an estimated 100,000 troops, which included 100 war elephants. This attack caught the Chinese completely unprepared, and reportedly thousands of Chinese troops drowned when a bridge collapsed as they tried to retreat. In the south, Nguyen An negotiated alliances with the French in 1787, signing a treaty known as the Treaty of Versailles, in which the French promised ships and troops in exchange for trade access. But as the French were on the verge of financial collapse and general revolution at the time, the foreign minister sent instructions saying the governor was, quote, free to not accomplish the expedition, or delay it, according to his own opinion. But Nguyen An was also able to get support from the King of Siam and build an army. With the Tay Son distracted in the north by the Chinese invasion, they were able to launch an offensive which captured Saigon and much of southern Vietnam. The Tay Son were well aware that trying to fight a war on two fronts was a losing battle. They sent diplomats to China to offer a tributary system similar to what existed under the past in exchange for an end to the conflict. This mission was a success despite the Tay Son leader Quang Trung sending a body double in his place out of fear of what might happen should he appear himself. And Quang Trung seemed to be making strong progress in stabilizing the country, even preparing to retake southern Vietnam, when he died suddenly at the age of 40 in 1792. This left his 11-year-old son to take his place. Nguyen An, seeing the weakness, launched an offensive, using French training, weapons, and technology to bomb walled cities. In 1801, a French officer wrote of one of the battles, quote, we have just burnt all the navy of the enemies, so that not even the smallest ship escaped. This was the bloodiest fight the Cochinese had ever seen. The enemies fought to the death. Our people behaved in a superior manner. We have many dead and wounded, but this is nothing compared to the advantages the king is receiving. By June of 1802, Nguyen An had conquered the Tay Son and declared himself emperor in the north and south. He took on the imperial name Gia Long and agreed to remain a Chinese tributary state. He changed the name of the country from Dai Viet to Vietnam and moved the capital to the city of Hue in central Vietnam. While Gia Long endorsed Confucian doctrines of governance, likely because of the support of the French, he permitted Catholic missionaries. But for all intents and purposes, only the French were given access, and the trade agreements made for the French kept other European rivals out. After Gia Long died in 1820, his successor, Minh Mạng, did not share his predecessor's views. In 1825, he banned Christian missionaries from entering Vietnam and ordered French vessels to be searched thoroughly, quote, lest some masters of the European religion inadvertently mix with the people and spread darkness in the kingdom. Royal edicts described Christianity as, quote, perverse, saying it was corrupting the hearts of men. Meng wasn't only focused on Catholics. He launched campaigns against a number of ethnic minorities throughout his reign, including the largely Muslim and Hindu people in the south. Reportedly, after conquering the groups in the south, he forced Muslims to eat pork and Hindus to eat beef, and forced assimilation programs. He also used military force to expand his territory into what is now Laos and Cambodia. In the 1830s, a number of rebellions broke out in the south, led by minority communities, which had been targeted along with the help of the Kingdom of Siam, who was attempting to take Cambodia from Vietnam. One of the largest of these rebellions was able to conquer 6 provinces in a single month, including the city of Saigon, with help of Catholic and Chinese settlers in the area who had been victims of oppression. But after 3 years, Minh Mạng was able to crush even this rebellion, retaking Saigon and reportedly executing 1,831 people in the last fortress, leaving only 6 survivors, one of whom was a French missionary by the name of Joseph Marchand. Marchand was later tortured and executed, along with the 8-year-old son of the leader of the rebellion, reportedly by having their flesh pulled from their bones with tongs, known as death by 1,000 cuts. While Minh Mạng was able to put down the rebellion and expand into areas like Cambodia, the cost of holding these areas was disastrous to the Vietnamese economy. When he died in 1841, a Cambodian uprising was in progress, and the country was in disarray, full of local rebellions, all of which required attentions and funds to put down. Around this same time, a cholera outbreak killed around 800,000 people, or between 8 to 10% of the entire population of Vietnam. In 1845, a French bishop was arrested and condemned to death, but French officials were able to negotiate his release. 2 years later, he was arrested again. French officials were able to negotiate his release, but they were not able to tell the French Navy before they had destroyed 5 Vietnamese ships in Da Nang Bay. This led the Vietnamese to cut off all European trade. Soon after, Tu Duc became emperor in 1847 and passed laws intended to purge Catholicism from Vietnam. In 1851, priests were ordered to abandon their faith or risk execution. By 1855, the laws called for all churches to be burned. In 1858, a combined French and Spanish naval fleet cited these actions as a pretext for invasion. They sent 14 warships and around 3,000 troops to attack the port city of Da Nang. But after 5 months, they were unable to hold much more than the unoccupied beaches near the city. The force then shifted south toward Saigon, where they had more success, occupying the city in 1859. But despite holding the city, they found themselves under siege for 2 years. They were so undermanned, they found themselves having to destroy the citadel of Saigon rather than trying to defend it. In 1860, the French were able to end a separate war with China, and 70 French ships bringing 3,500 additional troops came and reinforced Saigon. At the same time, northern Vietnam was being destabilized by refugees and raiders coming south due to the Taiping Rebellion in China. With these additional forces, the French were able to force Tu Duc to sign the Treaty of Saigon in 1862 that ceded Saigon and parts of South Vietnam to the French. In 1863, the French convinced the King of Cambodia to sign a treaty that made them a protectorate of France, ending Vietnamese control there. And by 1867, the French were able to force the Vietnamese to surrender more or less all of the Mekong Delta to what they now called French Cochinchina. But Tu Duc refused to formally acknowledge French control. But there was little they could do with it, as the northern government was dealing with instability from ethnic rebellions, as well as refugees and mercenary groups fleeing south from the Taiping Rebellion. One such group of mercenaries was known as the Black Flag Army. They were largely made up of soldiers from the failed Taipei Rebellion in China, and they reportedly flew black flags as a symbol of their unwillingness to surrender. But as they were on the losing side of the rebellion, they could be forced to retreat into northern Vietnam to escape the Chinese army. When the Black Flag Army entered northern Vietnam, they acted largely as bandits, pillaging villages and adding to the instability. The northern government, likely not strong enough to disband them, instead hired them to help suppress indigenous rebel groups. When the mercenaries succeeded at putting down rebellions, the government formalized the arrangement and gave their commander a formal military title and more or less legitimized the mercenaries as agents of the government. The Black Flag Army used this authority to run protection rackets along the Red River. They would force merchants to pay kickbacks and take control of mines, looting villages who refused payments. While the army was mainly Chinese, it did also contain a few Europeans and even American soldiers of fortune. The army was around 7,000 people. In 1873, a French military officer named Francis Garnier was sent north to bring home a French merchant living there who Vietnamese authorities had asked to be removed for interfering in local affairs. But the merchant instead convinced Garnier to join forces with him against the northern Vietnamese government. Despite having a relatively small force, his 2 French gunboats combined with local anger meant Garnier was able to have a great deal of success. He was able to capture Hanoi and much of the surrounding area. On hearing of Garnier's disobedience, the French government sent another officer to replace him, writing to Garnier, quote, "Have you thought about the shame that will befall you when it will be known that, having sent to expel some ruffian, you allied yourself with him to attack people who hadn't caused you any harm?" But before the letter could reach him, Garnier was killed by the Black Flag mercenaries. Garnier's replacement agreed to remove troops from the conquered cities in December of 1873, and in exchange, the northern Vietnamese formally signed the Treaty of Saigon, which acknowledged the French control of much of Cochinchina. Almost certainly inspired by Garnier, 9 years later, on April 25, 1883, a French naval captain named Henri Rivière sent an ultimatum of surrender to the governor of Hanoi, demanding immediate surrender. A few hours later, his forces attacked and took control of the citadel. All of this was done reportedly without any orders from his superiors. In the 9 years, the Black Flag Army had ceased to be an enemy of the Chinese government and had become a tool to maintain influence and control over the ever-weakening northern Vietnamese government. In December, the French government, seeking to avoid conflict with China, made an agreement that functionally divided Vietnam into France and China, seeking no input from the Vietnamese. This agreement would allow China to have authority over the north, known as Tonkin, and France the south, known as Cochinchina. But once again, Rivière ignored his superiors and acted on his own. He attacked and conquered the city of Nam Dinh and repelled an attack from his forces in Hanoi. He reportedly said, quote, "This will force them to take forward their Tonkin question." But before Rivière could see this happen, he followed in Garnier's footsteps in another way on May 10, 1883, when he was killed by the Black Flag Army. But his prediction did turn out to be true. The French government did shift to attempt to expand control over Tonkin, as well as Cochinchina, following his death, sending reinforcements to first maintain and then expand French control over the area. In August of 1883, the Vietnamese government was presented an ultimatum by the French administrator, which read, quote, "If we wanted to, we could destroy your dynasty root and branch, and seize for ourselves the entire kingdom, as we have done in Cochinchina. You know very well this would present no difficulty to our armies. For a moment, you hope to find help from the great empire on your borders, which has on several occasions posed as your suzerain. But even if such suzerain ever existed, and whatever the consequences that might have once resulted from it, it is now nothing but a historical curiosity. Now here is a fact which is quite certain. You are completely at our mercy. We have the power to seize and destroy your capital, and to starve you all to death. It is up to you to choose between war and peace. We do not wish to conquer you, but you must accept our protectorate. For your people, it is a guarantee of peace and prosperity. For your government and your court, it is the only chance of survival. We give you 48 hours to accept or reject, in their entirety and without discussion, the terms we are magnanimously offering you. We believe that there is nothing in them dishonorable to you, and if they are carried out with sincerity on both sides, they will bring happiness to the people of Annam. But if you reject them, you can expect to suffer the most terrible of misfortunes. The worst catastrophe you are capable of imagining will fall far short of what will actually befall you. The Empire of Annam, its royal dynasty, and its princes and court will have voted for their own extinction. The very name of Vietnam will be erased from history." The Vietnamese government agreed to accept becoming a French protectorate, but they did not control all of their forces, including the Black Flag Army, who received support from China. Even those they did control were not eager to call to comply with the treaty, often giving orders of defiance to the treaty to maintain forces and garrisons in Tonkin. All of this led to both proxy and open war between France and China, starting in August of 1884, which is now remembered as the Sino-French War. By 1887, all that is now modern Vietnam, as well as Cambodia, became part of French Indochina, but at great cost to all involved. While the French could claim legal control, that didn't stop local resistance. Guerrilla groups targeted not just the French and other Westerners, but Vietnamese Christians. In September 1885 alone, fighters allied with the Cong Nguyen movement reportedly killed approximately 40,000 Vietnamese Christians, which was nearly a third of the Vietnamese total Christian population. In just two towns, one Quan Yang and the other Bien Dinh, around 24,000 men, women, and children were killed in an area where only about 40,000 Christians lived in total. Rebellion forces were powerful enough to build and man a large fortified camp near Bai Dinh in January of 1887, but after thousands of resistance fighters were killed in a 2-month siege, resistance returned primarily to guerrilla attacks. Over time, the various Vietnamese nationalist movements began shifting from goals of restoring what came before to creating something entirely new. Many of the leaders of these groups were influenced by international education in either Japan, which had avoided colonization, China, which still often covertly supported dissident groups, or even in the West, where they sought to learn ways to modernize so they would be eventually able to overthrow the French rule. The French actively tried to suppress these movements, shutting down schools they deemed to be anti-French and arresting thousands of political prisoners, who were often sent to prison camps. In 1908, a group of nationalists became cooks at the Hanoi garrison, poisoning around 200 soldiers ahead of a planned surprise attack at the city. Reportedly, one of the chefs felt guilty for what he had done and went to confession, alerting a priest who alerted authorities, who immediately implemented martial law, stopping the forces hiding outside from being signaled and attacking. But small-scale revolts were nearly constant. Police officers were murdered in Hanoi in 1913, and riots broke out all over Cochin China the same year. As World War I broke out in Europe, Vietnamese nationalists began staging even more uprisings. These revolutionaries were encouraged by events around the world where similar uprisings had occurred: the overthrow of the Qing dynasty in 1911, the Russian Revolution in 1917, and the rise of Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese Nationalist Party in 1927. While all of these movements were incredibly different politically, they all shared the same goal: overthrowing who was in power. On February 10, 1930, at 1:30 in the morning, a group of 50 nationalist soldiers, aided by around 60 civilians, attempted a mutiny against French commanders in French Tonkin. They captured an armory and killed 5 French soldiers, wounding 3 others, but the uprising was quickly put down. That same year, a number of local Marxist and communist groups decided to unify under a single Vietnamese Communist Party. When World War II broke out and France was occupied by Nazi Germany, Japan invaded Vietnam. Some Vietnamese nationalist groups were hopeful this would lead to more autonomy, but those hopes were quickly dashed as the Japanese were more interested in using Vietnam as a place to gather resources for their war with China than in helping the Vietnamese people or even removing the French, whom the Japanese allowed to continue administration as a puppet government. As a Vietnamese political official put it, quote, "Militarily, after suppressing the ability of the French to offer resistance, the Japanese pirates turned on the Viet Minh to entice them to cease guerrilla attacks and cooperate with the Japanese. But all inducements to the Japanese army were rejected by the Viet Minh. The Japanese then went on the offensive to destroy our base areas. Wherever they went, the Japanese forces burned down homes, murdered law-abiding citizens, raped women, and stole possessions." Near the end of World War II, in the spring of 1945, the Japanese decided they could no longer trust the French administration to remain a loyal puppet state. They invaded in an effort to stage a coup and install a more reliable government, killing many in the French military, including those who surrendered. Approximately 15,000 French soldiers were taken prisoner by the Japanese, and of those, nearly 4,200 died in custody, many executed. In addition to the soldiers, nearly all French civil authorities and plantation owners were imprisoned, functionally ending any French colonial control over the region. On March 11, 1945, Japan declared that Bảo Đại was the Emperor of Vietnam, citing his lineage to the Nguyen dynasty, which had ceded power to the French in 1883. But despite the new emperor's claim that this was a declaration of Vietnamese independence, in truth he was a puppet leader for the Japanese, who themselves were only a few months from surrender to Allied forces. And while all of this was taking place, the Japanese and the French were confiscating huge amounts of crops that were already having poor yields. This, combined with shifts from food to cash crops instituted by the French colonial government, led to a massive starvation event starting in 1944 and continuing into 1945, leading to the deaths of between 400,000 and 2 million Vietnamese people. In July of 1945, Allied leaders agreed to divide what they called Indochina more or less in half at the 16th parallel, with the north being ceded to China and the south to France. But once again, none of this was agreed to by the Vietnamese themselves. Nationalist groups had met in northern Vietnam in 1941 to form the League for Independence of Vietnam, also known as the Viet Minh. They were led by a man named Ho Chi Minh, who had previously formed and led the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, and within the chaos of war, they were able to establish political and later military strongholds in northern and central Vietnam. The Viet Minh opposed both the French and Japanese occupations, attacking French outposts as well as raiding Japanese internment camps. By 1944, the Viet Minh claimed to have around 500,000 members all across Vietnam. The Viet Minh's opposition to the Japanese brought them funding from the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, and when Japan was forced to surrender to Allied forces, Japan was in no position to aid the government they had installed in stopping what came to be known as the August Revolution. By August 19th, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh forces had seized Hanoi. By August 25th, Bảo Đại abdicated and turned the government over to Viet Minh. On September 2nd, Ho Chi Minh declared independence for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But while this was largely accepted, if not celebrated in northern Vietnam, in southern Vietnam things were more complicated, as the Viet Minh had not spread as much in these areas, and British forces arrived in Saigon in 1945, bringing with them a detachment of French troops who sought to reestablish some level of control in the area. In northern Vietnam, an estimated 200,000 Chinese forces moved in, ostensibly to remove Japanese troops who were still holding out after surrender and to deter French reoccupation of the area. These forces were generally cautiously welcomed by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, and were provided rations and payments by the Viet Minh, despite mass starvation still occurring throughout the country. But Ho Chi Minh likely understood that without the Chinese forces, it would be almost impossible to stop the French from returning and reimposing colonial rule, given the weakness of his new government. And of course, Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, being on the verge of his own civil war with communist forces, was making his relationship with the communist Viet Minh even more complicated. On September 24th, a Vietnamese mob lynched roughly 150 French civilians in Saigon and kidnapped 150 more, many of whom were later murdered. The Viet Minh also set up roadblocks around Saigon in attempts to prevent Westerns from leaving the city. This led to many skirmishes with the British forces, who had just come to the city, and the skirmishes went poorly for the less trained Viet Minh. And this was all occurring while some Japanese troops were continuing to fight and occupy forts, despite Japan's surrender. By October, over 300 Viet Minh forces had been killed in skirmishes with the British, and another 200 were killed in fights with those left behind by Japanese forces. By mid-January of 1946, the Viet Minh decided to change tactics, avoiding direct conflict and engaging in more guerrilla-style actions, such as hit-and-run attacks and targeted assassinations. The British generally wanted no part of this conflict. They withdrew and handed over operations to the French, with most British forces leaving by March of 1946, with the last British casualties being recorded as 6 soldiers in June of 1946. But the French remained. In March of 1946, the French and Ho Chi Minh agreed to allow a limited number of French troops, ostensibly replacing the Chinese troops who were being pulled back into China ahead of the impending Chinese Civil War. In exchange, the French agreed to acknowledge the Viet Minh as a free state within the French Indochinese Confederation. But this agreement was short-lived, as by November, conflict broke out between the Viet Minh and the French that led to the French bombarding 6 sections of the city of Haiphong, leading to the death of a reported 6,000 Vietnamese civilians in one single afternoon. By January of 1947, the French used their naval firepower to take control of nearly every major city, as the Viet Minh learned they could not win a direct confrontation. But the Viet Minh had also learned the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare, and the French were unable to capture Ho Chi Minh or destroy his forces. Reportedly, the French engaged in brutal tactics in an attempt to restore control, including reports of mass rape. A French reporter was told, quote, "We know what war always is. We understand your soldiers are taking our animals, our joy, our Buddhas. It is normal. We are resigned to their raping our wives and our daughters. War was always like that. But we object to being treated in the same way, not only our sons, but ourselves, old men and dignitaries that we are." But rather than crushing dissent, French brutality only increased support for anyone who would bring independence from French rule. Looking for an alternative to Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, French authorities reached out to Bảo Đại, the emperor installed by the Japanese, to be part of a Vietnamese state which could be claimed to be independent while still supporting French interests. This was the same model the French had used to gain independence in nearby Laos and Cambodia. In January of 1949, a Vietnamese national army was created, and Bảo Đại was appointed chief of state. In 1950, France recognized the state of Vietnam as an independent nation ruled by Bảo Đại. The Viet Minh did not. Viet Minh forces continued guerrilla attacks on French convoys and infrastructure that had become even more emboldened by the success of the communist revolutionaries in neighboring China, who had overthrown their government in 1949. While the French were acknowledging the state of Vietnam, Communist China and the Soviet Union instead recognized the Viet Minh as the true ruling government. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, and the Soviets in China supported the Communist North Koreans, and the United States and Western powers supported South Korea, American politicians began to promote what came to be known as Domino Theory. This was the belief that if you allowed a state to become communist, that the ideology would then spread to neighboring countries. America suddenly became very interested in the conflict in Vietnam, viewing it through the lens of this theory, but it was still the French whose soldiers were involved in the conflict. In September of 1950, the Viet Minh were able to launch an offensive campaign that allowed them to capture nearly half of Tonkin in northern Vietnam, in the process killing around 6,000 French soldiers who found themselves encircled by Viet Minh forces. Likely emboldened by this success, Viet Minh leaders began a formal offensive in January of 1951, moving approximately 20,000 troops against a French fortification northwest of Hanoi, held by around 6,000 troops. But once again, open traditional warfare led to defeat, with between 5,000 and 6,000 Viet Minh troops being killed and another 500 captured in the failed attack. Similar attacks on French fortifications throughout the year continued to fail, leading to a bloody stalemate between the two sides for the next 2 years. But with support from Russia and China, in 1954, the Viet Minh were able to have a breakthrough, having success in winning the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, as the French headquarters position was overrun. The last words received from the French radio operator were, quote, "The enemy has overrun us. We are blowing up everything. Vive la France." Death estimates for the French range from 1,500 to nearly 2,300, with another 6,500 wounded and over 11,000 captured. While the Vietnamese casualties were even higher, estimated between 8,000 and 23,000 deaths, the French losses were roughly 10% of the French forces in the area, while the Vietnamese ability to grow and recruit grew with each victory. A commission looking into the failure wrote, quote, "The fall of Dien Bien Phu, in a strictly military perspective, represented a very serious failure, but one that in the immediate, that is to say, spring of 1954, did not upset the balance of forces present in Indochina. It only assumed the aspect of a definitive defeat of our forces by the reason of its profound psychological effects on the French public opinion, which, tired of a war that was unpopular and seeming without end, demanded in a way that it be ended. The event itself was, in fact, both in terms of public opinion and of the military conduct of the war and operations, merely the end result of a long process of degradation of a faraway enterprise which, not having the assent of the nation, could not receive from the authorities the energetic impulse and the size and continuity of efforts required for success. In other areas occupied by colonial powers, particularly those occupied by French colonial powers, it was seen as a symbol of hope. Ferhat Abbas, who would become Algeria's first president after French colonization ended, said of the event, quote, Dien Bien Phu was more than just a military victory. This battle is a symbol. It is the Valmet of the colonized people. It is the affirmation of the Asian and the African vis-a-vis the European. It is the confirmation of the universality of human rights. At Dien Bien Phu, the French lost the only source of legitimization on which their presence turned. That is the right of the strongest to rule the weakest. A ceasefire was reached on July 21, 1954, recognizing the 17th parallel as, quote, provisional military demarcation line. And that same year, the United States began what they called Operation Passage to Freedom, which evacuated approximately 310,000 Vietnamese from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. This was conducted alongside efforts by the French, which may have evacuated another 500,000, but funding was largely from the United States, who were beginning to step into the conflict as the French were leaving it. While the partition was written to be temporary, it only provided 300 days for movement between the two sides before the borders became fixed and enforced and travel restricted. This migration was also intended to move Catholic voters south, where they would be able to vote in a 1955 referendum scheduled to take place in southern Vietnam. And these Catholic voters, presumably, would be more likely to support the newly selected Prime Minister, Ngo Dinh. Diem was a Vietnamese nationalist, but he was also a Roman Catholic. And most importantly for the United States, he wasn't a communist like Ho Chi Minh. Diem had traveled to the United States in 1951 and met with a number of government officials. He then traveled Europe to seek support for setting up anti-communist governments, but had little success. His next trip to the United States was more successful, where he met with a number of high-ranking government officials, including several members of Congress. While most were skeptical that a devout Roman Catholic would be able to effectively rule a non-Catholic country, some seemed to believe he was the best available option. As Congressman Mike Mansfield wrote following meeting with Diem in 1953, quote, if anyone could hold South Vietnam, it was someone like Ngo Dinh. But the Geneva Treaty had a provision which required an election be held, included both the North and the South. And as Dwight Eisenhower wrote in 1954, quote, I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held at the time of the fighting, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh. So the plan was to hold a referendum only in South Vietnam, from which the new government would be formed, one that technically never signed the Geneva Treaty. Estimates are that roughly 60% of the 1.4 million Catholics living in northern Vietnam were able to be convinced to move to southern Vietnam, following a propaganda campaign that warned of, quote, impending religious persecution by the communist northern leaders. The referendum in the South was reported to be deciding if South Vietnam would remain a monarchy, led by Bảo Đại, or become a republic, led by Diem. But regardless of where the international community had arbitrarily drawn lines, much of the South Vietnamese countryside was under the control of the Viet Minh, while the South Vietnamese government really only held onto the cities, and even there only to a point. Saigon specifically was more under the control of criminal syndicates who paid kickbacks to Bảo Đại for the police to look the other way in terms of gambling and prostitution. When Diem became prime minister, he replaced the chief of police without consulting Bảo Đại. On March 29th and 30th, explosions broke out, and around 200 members of criminal gangs attacked police headquarters, killing 6 police officers. Fighting between the government and the gangs continued for nearly a month, with large numbers of civilian deaths after artillery was used in the city by government forces. 1 square mile of the city, where the criminal syndicate headquarters was, became more or less a war zone. Eventually, Diem's Vietnamese National Army was able to force the leader of the gangs to flee to France, demonstrating Diem's power and control over the military. There was already animosity against Bảo Đại from the population due to his corruption and cooperation with Japanese and French officials. But Diem also used his power and influence as prime minister to pass laws that make campaigning either for Bảo Đại or against him illegal. State media was used to attack Bảo Đại, spreading claims that his wife was a French agent and that he was functionally a puppet of the French government, and had police arrest anyone supporting Bảo Đại or saying anything against Diem. And if that weren't enough to make sure he won, Diem's government was also in charge of counting the votes. The government reported that 98.91% of the vote went to Diem, with over 500,000 more voters reported voting than had been registered to vote. The United States issued a statement that read, quote, the Department of State is gratified that according to the reports, the referendum was conducted in such an orderly and efficient manner that the people of Vietnam have made their choice unmistakably clear. We look forward to a continuation of the friendly relations between the government of Vietnam and the United States. 3 days after the election, on October 23, 1955, Diem proclaimed the creation of the Republic of Vietnam. Diem formally withdrew from the French Union and claimed his government would sever economic ties with France. But in reality, France accounted for over 40% of the South Vietnamese exports, and it was still its largest source of French investments going into the 1960s. But the French did withdraw its forces in 1956, in large part because of uprisings in Algeria. And the 1956 referendum, that would include North and South, as was agreed to in Geneva, simply did not happen. The National Control Council issued a report in 1957 that stated, quote, "The elections were not held. South Vietnam, which had not signed the Geneva Accords, did not believe the communists in North Vietnam would allow a fair election." In January of 1957, the ICC agreed with this perception, reporting that neither North nor South Vietnam had honored the armistice agreement. With the French gone, a return to the traditional power struggle between the North and South had begun again. Despite rising to power fighting a criminal army in Saigon, Diem's rule proved to be just as corrupt, if not more corrupt than what came before. Members of his Can Lao party were given special favors and access to power over those widely viewed as more competent, and his administration was largely unpopular. North Vietnam used their control of rural areas in the south to build an insurgency movement against the South Vietnamese government, and while Ho Chi Minh publicly argued violence should be a last resort, his party was engaged in large-scale political assassination campaigns in South Vietnam as early as 1956. These were often large-scale public acts intended to instill fear. For example, in July of 1957, it was reported that 19 people were killed by machine gun fire in broad daylight in the city of Chau Doc. In September, a district chief was killed along with his entire family on a main road in broad daylight. In October, a series of bomb attacks killed 13 Americans. It's estimated that between 1957 and 1960, around 2,000 people in southern Vietnam were abducted by northern Vietnamese forces, with around 1,700 being assassinated. Diem responded by opening, quote, political re-education centers, where at least 65,000 people were detained, and reportedly more than 2,000 were killed in 1957 alone. The order creating these camps read, quote, individuals considered dangerous to the national defense and common security be confined by executive order to a concentration camp. But this was shown to be ineffective, as by 1958, the paramilitary army of northern Vietnamese, known as the Viet Cong, more or less controlled many areas of South Vietnam, particularly around the eastern Mekong Delta region. By 1959, the North Vietnamese Communist Party were openly calling for a, quote, People's War, and a route known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail was being used to move weapons and supplies south through Cambodia and Laos in order to arm the growing insurrection movement. During much of this, American military advisors had been embedded with the Southern Vietnamese, but it wasn't until July of 1959 that the first two American military deaths occurred. By 1960, roughly a third of the population of South Vietnam lived in areas occupied and controlled by the Viet Cong. It was around this time that the North Vietnamese instituted conscription laws to support the large number of soldiers being sent to infiltrate South Vietnam. In November of 1960, Vietnamese military leaders attempted a coup. While they were able to capture the headquarters of the Joint General Staff, the air base near Saigon, ultimately the coup was unsuccessful. However, the leader of the attempted coup was a colonel who had been trained in America and was well respected by U.S. military forces. When the coup leaders called the ambassador Elbridge Durbau to ask for assistance in removing Diem, the request was denied, with Durbau saying, "We support this government until it fails." The United States was well aware of Diem's unpopularity, with one intelligence assessment describing the situation in August as, quote, worsening of internal security, the promotion of incompetent officers, and Diem's direct interference in army operations, his political favoritism, inadequate delegation of authority, and the influence of the Can Lao. Following the coup attempt, Diem no longer trusted the support of the United States, and he wasn't entirely wrong, as Durbau had been arguing for some time that Diem was making things worse with his authoritarian actions toward the opposition, and this was creating more dissent and an opportunity for the North Vietnamese to exploit. But some of the military disagreed. Then Colonel Edward Lansdale wrote that Diem was, quote, the only Vietnamese with executive ability and the required determination to be an effective president. He called for the ambassador to be removed, stating, quote, at the most critical moment of the coup, the U.S. ambassador urged Diem to give in to the rebels' demands to avoid bloodshed. Adding to his lack of popularity, Diem's policies favored Catholics while ruling a country that was between 70% and 90% Buddhist. This favoritism was not subtle, with him reportedly telling a high-ranking Buddhist official he believed was Catholic, quote, put your Catholic officers in sensitive places, they can be trusted. This led to many soldiers pretending to be Catholic just for career advancement. Some Catholic priests were even given weapons to build local self-defense militias to repel the Viet Cong, but at times they would use these weapons as part of forced conversion campaigns. Despite their minority status, Because of the prior French occupation of the Catholic Church, the Church remained the largest landowners in the country, and Diem's government exempted them from land reform. When John F. Kennedy won the presidency, Diem now had a president in America who was both a Catholic and a firm believer in Domino Theory. And reportedly, Kennedy was looking for a way to make up for the failure of the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961, saying to the New York Times, quote, "Now we have a problem making our power credible, and Vietnam looks like the place." He was told by his defense secretary, Robert McNamara, that it was, quote, "absurd to think that a nation of 20 million people can be subverted by 15 to 20,000 active guerrillas if the government and the people of that country do not wish to be subverted." Kennedy, who had met Diem as a congressman as part of Diem's outreach to Catholic leaders, increased support for Diem and approved a number of covert missions targeting North Vietnam. In April of 1962, John Kenneth Galbraith warned Kennedy of the, quote, "danger we shall replace the French as a colonial force, and bleed as the French did." But Kennedy still increased the number of American advisors in Vietnam from Eisenhower's 900 to 16,000. But Kennedy's support didn't stop Diem from doing things that continued to make himself unpopular. Catholics were given exemptions from forced public works projects, which were sometimes ordered in place of taxation. In May of 1963, a rarely used law was invoked that banned the display of religious flags just before a major Buddhist festival, and only a few weeks after Catholics had waved the Vatican flag at a separate celebration. When on May 8th a group of Buddhists protested in the city of Hue, police threw grenades into the crowd, killing 9 people and wounding many others, and Diem denied his government was responsible for the killing, attempting to blame the Viet Cong. On May 30th, more than 500 Buddhist monks protested in front of the National Assembly in Saigon, despite a ban on public assembly. A few days later, on June 3rd, in the city of Hue, where the shooting had taken place, Vietnamese police and soldiers poured chemicals from tear gas grenades directly onto the heads of the praying protesters. As a result, 67 of them were hospitalized. When asked about the event, Diem reportedly said that those officials lacked, quote, "sufficient comprehensive and sensitivity," but still denied any wrongdoing. On June 11th, a Buddhist monk set himself on fire in the middle of a busy intersection in Saigon in protest. Diem's brother was a major government official, and his wife, a woman by the name of Madame Yu, reportedly said of the event, quote, "let them burn and we shall clap our hands," and, quote, "if the Buddhists wish to have another barbecue, I will gladly supply the gasoline and a match." After a series of raids of Buddhist temples, the United States government sent a cable to Ambassador of Vietnam on August 24, 1963, which authorized the United States to begin collaborating with South Vietnamese troops to have Diem removed in a coup. On October 1st, Diem was meeting with a U.S. official and reportedly told them, quote, "I know there's going to be a coup attempt, but I don't know who's going to do it." But he was told by the U.S. there was nothing to worry about. Diem reportedly refused what had been an ongoing request to remove his brother from his position of power, saying, quote, "please tell President Kennedy I'm a good and frank ally, that I would rather be frank and settle questions than talk about them after we have lost everything. Tell President Kennedy that I take all his suggestions very seriously and I wish to carry them out, but it is a question of timing." Later that day, the coup began, and the leaders were able to capture the palace and force Diem to surrender early in the morning of November 2nd. But before he and his brother could be captured, they escaped through secret tunnels. But their escape was short-lived, as they were found not too far away shortly after. Initially, the plan was to exile Diem and his brother, but both men were killed or being transported after they were captured. A witness later reported, quote, "as we rode back to the Joint Chiefs headquarters, Diem sat silently, but Yu and the captain began to insult each other. I don't know who started it. The name-calling grew passionate. The captain had hated Yu before, but now he was charged with the motion." The witness then said the convoy reached a train crossing, and at that point, quote, "the captain lunged at Yu with a bayonet and stabbed him again and again, maybe 15 or 20 times. Still in a rage, he turned to Diem, took out his revolver, and shot him in the head. Then he looked back at Yu, who was lying on the floor twitching, and he put a bullet in his head too. Neither Diem or Yu ever defended themselves. Their hands were tied." That same month, on November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and Lyndon Johnson became president. Robert McNamara stayed on his role as Secretary of Defense, and continued to argue that the North Vietnamese could be defeated with sufficient military support. As a result, Johnson largely continued and expanded the policies of Kennedy. Johnson approved expanding the covert mission to include bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. Laos was having a civil war between royalist and communist forces, and North Vietnam largely occupied eastern Laos along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In August of 1964, the USS Maddox reportedly fired on torpedo boats. A few days later, another attack was reported, but there was no actual attack. This all was used as a pretext for the United States to engage in airstrikes openly on North Vietnam, and to convince Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave Johnson the power to, quote, take all necessary measure to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. All pretext was now gone. Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force Curtis LeMay would say of the plan, quote, we're going to bomb them back into the Stone Age. But this only drove more support to the North and the Viet Cong. Johnson initially said he was not, quote, committing American boys to fighting a war that I think ought to be fought by the boys of Asia to help protect their own land. But by 1965, it was clear the South Vietnamese army was not up to the task. In March of 1965, 3,500 Marines were sent to Vietnam, initially with overwhelming public support. This force grew to 200,000 under the command of General William Westmoreland, who said, quote, I am convinced that U.S. troops with their energy, mobility, and firepower can successfully take the fight to the NLF. But he was mistaken. In January of 1968, roughly 180 years after another Vietnamese army executed a surprise attack to push the Chinese out of northern Vietnam, the Viet Cong initiated another Tet Offensive. They attacked over 100 cities with over 85,000 troops, catching the Americans and South Vietnamese forces by surprise. While the capture of some cities was generally short-lived, it shattered the illusion of control that the American public had been sold. As McNamara himself put it, quote, the dangerous illusion of victory by the United States was therefore dead. Richard Nixon won the presidency, in part running on claims that he had a secret plan to end the war. But after he took office, he actually expanded the war to include supporting incursions into Cambodia and Laos. Nixon's stated plan was to train the Vietnamese to take the place of American troops. His actions, however, included ordering large-scale bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia, presumably to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail and stop the rise of another Marxist group in Cambodia known as the Khmer Rouge. An estimated 108,000 tons of bombs were dropped onto eastern Cambodia. Nixon gave a speech on April 30th, 1970, where he stated he'd rather be a one-term president than, quote, be a two-term president at the cost of seeing America become a second-rate power. He advocated for sending American forces into Cambodia. His plan not only failed to stop the northern incursion to the south, but arguably increased the destabilization of both Laos and Cambodia, leading to the communist revolutionary forces in both countries to take power in the 1970s. But Nixon still won re-election in 1972 with 60% of the vote. Nixon's government engaged in secret negotiations with the northern Vietnamese over a ceasefire, which were announced formally on January 28, 1973. But only the United States honored the agreement. The war continued, and on April 30, 1975, the North Vietnamese army captured Saigon, while American helicopters were filmed attempting to aid evacuations. Deaths from the war in Vietnam ranged from around 900,000 to 3 million Vietnamese, and hundreds of thousands more deaths occurred in Cambodia and Laos from bombing campaigns and the effects of war in those countries. In 1976, the city of Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City after the leader had died in 1969. The now combined North and South Vietnamese states were called the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Victory now achieved by the North, the leaders of this new country detained between 200,000 and 500,000 South Vietnamese and sent them to so-called re-education camps, where they were to, quote, learn about the ways of the new government. In 1980, Janetta Sagan, who was well known for her protest against the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, wrote of these re-education camps, quote, during the last 3 years, friends and I have interviewed several hundred former prisoners, read newspaper articles in the camps, as well as various reports of Amnesty International, and have studied official statements of the Vietnamese government and its press on the re-education camps. The picture that emerges is one of severe hardship, where the prisoners are kept on a starvation diet, overworked and harshly punished for minor infractions of camp rules. We know of cases where prisoners have been beaten to death, confined to dark cells or in ditches dug around the perimeters of the camps, and executed for attempting escape. A common form of punishment is confinement to the Connex boxes, air freight containers that were left behind by the United States in 1975. The boxes vary in size. Some are made of wood and others of metal. In a Connex box 4 feet high and 4 feet wide, for example, several prisoners can be found with their feet shackled and allowed only 1 bowl of rice and water a day. It reminded me of the pictures I saw of Nazi camp inmates after World War II, said a physician we interviewed who witnessed the release of the 4 prisoners who had been confined in the Connex pack for 1 month. None of them survived. History is awkward.